Hello and welcome to A Day in the Life. My name is Fred Hacker and I'm your host and community producer. This is program number 112 in this series, and we're delighted that you're with us today. Our series sponsors are Kathy Bales, Michelle Deschamps, and Jeff Holloway of RBC Dominion Securities. We also want to thank our show sponsor for this program, Danielle Dorion and Vanya Gluich from Georgian Bay Dream Team with Rebel Realty Brokerage, Georgian Bay Branch. Well, I am delighted to welcome and to introduce the former Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police, Chris Lewis. Welcome, Chris.
Good afternoon, Fred. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad you're here and looking forward to learning more about Ontario's police force.
Chris, happy to help.
Great. We try and focus in this program on points of inspiration, things that have inspired you, people who have inspired you during your life, and we also try and inspire our viewers through your life. So, want to begin with where and when you were born?
Well, I was born in Sault Ste. Marie, Fred, in 1957. Small town in northern Ontario, a steel town. I thought I'd probably spend most of my life there, but as I got into high school and beyond, I realized there's a bigger world out there, and kind of went on from there.
Tell us about your parents, Chris, and what sort of values you learned from them.
Well, my parents were a very kind of lower middle class folks, wonderful people. My dad, Doran Lewis, just died this past year at age 90. My mom, Betty, several years ago, unfortunately with Alzheimer's, so the last several years of her life were tough. But they instilled values in me around honesty and hard work and humor, treating people well. My dad was a real strong people person, and he really instilled that in me. He was incapable of going anywhere without looking for people he knew that he could say hi to. And as a kid, I thought that was kind of weird. But as I grew up, I realized that became my father, and that's who I am to this day.
You started to do it yourself. Yeah. Now, you were one of 5 boys?
I was one of 4. I had 3 brothers at one time. I was the oldest of the 4 boys. My mom had all cesarean sections back in those days.
Wow.
So they had to be 3 years apart. And so we were all 3 years apart. My brother David, who was born in 1960, was killed in 1980 when he was only 19 years of age in an industrial accident. So he'd be 60 now. And then I've got a brother, Mark, in the Sioux, and another brother, Robbie. And Robbie's a Special Olympic athlete, cross-country skier, and someone I'm really so proud of. He's just a wonderful guy.
Tell us about your schooling experience, your early schooling.
Well, I went to a high school in Sault Ste. Marie that no longer exists. I guess once I left, they figured there's no point continuing, or all the teachers were in therapy. But it was a great school, the Sault Collegiate Institute, SCI. And, I really, being a people person, I think I learned a lot for what would help me succeed as much as I could in life and in my career by just being with people in small town Ontario, wonderful people, and spending a lot of time watching, listening, and learning from them. And that really was a big part of my high school. Besides sports and other things I was involved in, it was all about people.
I understand that there was a certain football coach who may have had a significant role to play in your life.
Well, we had 2 football coaches. One was a former CFL player and a huge man that scared the heck out of me. He certainly kept me in line. But there was a coach named Walter Kroshak that has since deceased, an American, and just a great guy. And he saw something in me from a leadership perspective. I wasn't the best player on the team, but I was captain of the junior team. I was captain of the senior team eventually. And he really... He taught me in ways I don't know that he taught me, in terms of my temper, in terms of my aggressiveness, trying to temper some of those things, pardon the pun, and also, reeling me in when I needed it. And there was a couple of times along the way in high school. He was also a phys ed teacher, so I had a lot of interaction with him. But, he kind of showed me when the right time was to do and say certain things and when not. And I learned a lot from that.
And then after high school, you didn't go right into the police. You actually did something that I think is fascinating. Tell us about your first job out of high school.
Well, after high school, and other than summer jobs all through high school, of course, I took a year off before applying to university. And I joined the profession known as the Great Lakes shipping area. And I worked tugboats out of Sault Ste. Marie. And I also spent a few years in Detroit working for a company there during the winter when the northern shipping season was closed. And I worked tugboats, hauling ships, pushing barges, working. I was an 18-year-old when I started, and I was working with all guys in their 40s and 50s, traveling all over with them. And I learned a lot about people from them too, some good and some bad, but people that, without a doubt, influenced my life and who I became as an adult.
And you'd make pretty good money doing that too, wouldn't you?
I made huge money. You know, in 1977, the last year I sailed, I made $30,000.
Wow.
In 1978, wow. I know my father made 19,000, and he was raising a family and had a mortgage and all those things I didn't have. So the money was really good. And it was very tempting to stay in that profession for that reason, but I wanted to settle down and not travel all the time. So I joined the OPP and spent the next 36 years living out of a suitcase, but it turned out to be a very rewarding career at the same time.
Tell me, Chris, how long did you spend on the Great Lakes?
I was there. I started at 18, left at 21. So I spent 3 years, but I worked year round. Not very many sailors did.
Right.
When the locks closed in Sault Ste. Marie, that was the end of the shipping season up north. But with tugboats, we went year round. And so I was all over the place in those tugboats. And then during the shipping season, from Chicago to Thunder Bay and all points in between. And then in the winter, mostly around the Detroit area, up to Sarnia and back and forth across the river from Detroit to Windsor and so forth. It was a great job and a lot of fun and exciting at times and huge money. But, you know, there were some things in that job that started to wear on me already. I could feel that, you know, drinking was a big part of the job. Yeah. And so as an 19-year-old, I'm sitting in bars at night with other sailors that are 45 and 50. And I started to realize there had to be a little bit more to life than doing that. Great people, but they were kind of locked in a lifestyle.
Right. So where did you begin your OPP career? I
started in the OPP in September 78 in Kapuskasing, Ontario. I asked to go north in the OPP, and of course I knew they had a fish on the line when I said those words, I suppose. Off I went to Cap. I was engaged at the time, and my high school sweetheart was going to University of Western Ontario. So there's long ways between Cap and London. But, you know, I had the most wonderful coach officer in the world. He was mid-40s, Dutchman, immigrant with a full family and a very mature, bright, easygoing person that I just really clicked with. And his family really brought me into their fold. And so I fit right in with them, and I developed lasting relationships there. And I really enjoyed the work at Kapuskasing. It was an exciting time for me.
I'm interested to hear that you offered to go north, because many OPP officers go north, but it may be a little more kicking and screaming than you.
Well, you know, I could have said I wanted to go to Bracebridge or Huntsville or one of those places that were really popular to go to then. Yeah. But I really, truly wanted to be in the north. I also thought Northern Ontario was Sault Ste. Marie, Thessalon, Sudbury. I forgot the map got really big on the other side. And so, you know, when Kapuskasing they told me you're hired, you're going to Cap, I didn't even really know where it was. Yeah. But I remember during the interview, they asked me if I was willing to go to Manaki. And I had one friend in the world that I knew in Manaki. He was a guy I'd sailed with, and he'd moved to Manaki. I said, I'd love to go to Manaki. And they all look at one another at the interview panel like they struck. They couldn't believe that. The first time they ever heard that come out of somebody's mouth. But they sent me to Cap, and I'm glad that's where they sent me.
Where was your second stop?
I went to Smooth Rock Falls. I did a staffing study in 1980 and decided Kapuskasing had 2 officers more than the workload really called for. And Smooth Rock Falls was short one, and Iroquois Falls was short one. So they gave me the option, and I picked Smooth Rock Falls, which is the next detachment over from Cap to the east on Highway 11.
Right.
And so, but it was only 6 constables and a corporal. It was a small, quiet detachment. We called it the Iron Curtain. We said you can't get through Kapuskasing without talking to the OPP, or through Smooth Rock rather, without talking to the OPP. So we stopped a lot of cars, seized a lot of drugs and liquor, and laid a lot of charges. But it was a small town that I got very involved in, and once again developed lifelong friends when I got there.
You were there for a fairly short period of time, though, weren't you?
I'm sorry, Fred. I'm not hearing you very well.
Okay, I was asking how long you were there. I think that was a short stop along your road, was it?
It was a short stop. I was there 2.5 years. I almost quit when I got there because, or when I got sent there. My brother had just been killed. I was getting married. I thought my parents needed me, so I went to the Sault Ste. Marie police chief, who was a friend of my dad's, told him I wanted to quit the OPP and come to the Sioux and explain the transfer situation. He gave me advice I'll never forget. He said, take your transfer, be honest with yourself, and give it an honest shot. And if you're not happy in a year from now, come and see me and I'll hire you.
Oh, that's
and I said, okay, I committed to doing that. And he said, I have a feeling I'll never see you again. And he didn't see me again, not in that role, but we stayed friends over the years, and the man I respect to this day, and he's in his 90s as well. But he really kind of saved me from myself, because
right.
if I'd gone to the Sioux, I probably never would have got promoted as often, and I wouldn't have had the exciting travel and whatnot I got out of the OPP.
Now, your next stop along the road was an interesting one. That was in a specialized unit.
It was. I was a member of the Tactics and Rescue Unit, TRU. Which is, for all intents and purposes, SWAT. And you remember the old TV series from the 70s.
Sure.
But all high risk, high threat type calls, many involving firearms, barricaded people, raids on biker clubhouses. All those ones where violence is very likely.
Yeah.
And so very highly trained, very close team of officers that worked together and responded to those calls. And so I went to London to do that after a year and a half of training. And so I went to London in 82. And at that time, I only had about 4.5 years on the job. But I only had 3 on when I started true training, which really, in hindsight, probably I wasn't as well-rounded as maybe I should have been at that point. But they took a chance on me anyway, and I went to true. And boy, those were some amazing years. The good, the bad, and the ugly, as I call it, because there were some horrendous situations and some wonderful calls along the way.
I do want to ask you about one of those situations, but before that, you were promoted to corporal while you were there. Is that right? I
was, yes. It was a 6-officer team with a corporal and 5 constables. And I was promoted to corporal and put in charge of the team in 85. And I was acting first and then promoted into the position. So I was in charge of that group of officers as a very young, 6-year kind of 7-year corporal. It was pretty interesting times and challenging. And this, without a doubt, there's times I wondered if I was up to the challenge, but I always did my best and managed to get through it.
Chris, one of those challenges occurred in Woodstock. Do you mind telling us about that story?
Yeah, it was on Thanksgiving weekend, 1984, and 2 very evil human beings shot and killed a police officer, shot and killed a civilian in Montreal. The civilian was a teenager with a nice car, and they stole the car. And they didn't know the teenager's father was associated with organized crime. So this eventually became an issue for the one that survived when he went to jail. He was subsequently murdered. But they came to Woodstock. They had a hostage for a while. They dumped him, and they hid out in a house in Woodstock. We got information that they were in the house. We surrounded the house, and one of the bad guys, come out with another civilian that wasn't a killer, and a shootout occurred in the front lawn of a house, and one of our officers on the tactical team mistakenly shot and killed a uniformed OPP officer.
Oh, no.
A wonderful guy named Jack Ross. And our officer, truly, it's a long story that we don't have time to get into, but our officer deemed him to be a threat because another OPP officer got shot and was lying on the lawn. And when he looked around the corner, he perceived that other person to be the threat, and he killed him. Very tragic situation. And that officer quit the OPP and went on to be a successful businessman, a wonderful guy.
Yeah.
But that had a big impact on me in a lot of ways, particularly in my emotional health. And I learned a lot from that as to how organizationally and as leaders we need to treat people that are going through those tough times, because nothing gets worse than you got a dead bad guy, a dead cop, and a wounded cop all laying on the front lawn, and you're in the middle of it all.
Wow. Now, there were a couple of other highlights that were a little more positive. A couple of motorcade security events. Can you tell us about that? Because this is fun.
Well, for sure. In 1984, that same year, earlier in the year, was a big year for us because the Pope came from Rome. He came to Midland, Ontario,
right,
and not far from where I'm sitting as we speak. He went to the shrine, the Martyr Shrine, and so the OPP brought well over 1,000 officers into this area to provide security to the Pope while he was here. He was brought in and was escorted around the community by a motorcade that I was a part of, and then flown out in the chopper. But that was a big event, the biggest security event probably we'd ever done as an organization. And that same year, the Queen of England and Prince Charles came to, Prince Philip, her husband, came to Canada, and I was involved in the motorcade there from basically from Cornwall, Ontario, all the way to Windsor, with stops all along the way, including the city of Toronto. So those are big security events. And wow, what a thing to look ahead 4 or 5 cars up and see the Queen of England sitting in a car being driven by an RCMP officer. It was pretty amazing times. And not that I would benefit financially, but there was one pile of overtime involved in both of those details. So sure. It was a great experience, and without a doubt, a bit of a moneymaker as well.
Yeah. Now, from there, you went to headquarters.
I did. I decided I was either going to stay in the SHREW team forever, and of course, the physical aspects and the emotional aspects of that wouldn't have been a good decision. But I loved it, and I loved the guys that I worked with. But I decided my heart lied in investigations ultimately. I always wanted to be a detective from the day I joined the OPP. Right. And so I ended up being a wiretap investigation coordinator. So we did wiretaps legally with court orders that I prepared and officers, colleagues I worked with prepared. And we did wiretaps and hid microphones and listened to telephone lines and all of that in relation to organized crime figures, homicide investigations, and on and on. So that was a pretty interesting job too, actually breaking into houses under the authority of a court order to hide microphones and do wiretaps, and then listening to them and gathering evidence. Pretty neat stuff.
Now, there's a story, Chris, about an unusual place to hide a microphone. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, by all means. And that, my nickname amongst the investigative folks was Digger. And the story behind that is we had an officer shot and killed in Renfrew, Ontario, just outside of Renfrew, in 1987 in August. And his name was Ralph Miller. And he was shot and killed in bed. And we eventually arrested his wife for that murder. She shot him and then called it in as if someone else had done it. But she had been seen out at the cemetery laying on the grave. So the CIB inspector in charge of the case said, "Can we wire that? Can we put a microphone there?" And we said, "Well, we don't know that it's ever been done, but we did." And we got a court order. The judge signed it, I think a little reluctantly, but he signed it. And we hid the microphone and we recorded her when she lied out there in the blanket talking to her dead husband. And eventually that gave us more evidence and caused us to investigate other things that we charged her with murder.
Just out of curiosity, what was the judge's reaction when he first heard what you were proposing?
Well, the Crown Attorney that I was working with told me the judge is a very known, very religious man. And he turned and he read it and he turned and he looked out the window and there was a pause of about 45 seconds where he didn't say a word. And the Crown kept looking at me out of the corner of his eye going, "Oh my God." And he turned around and said, "Okay," and he signed it. And
wow.
Of course, we all, had it turned out she didn't do it, and had we been listening to her as an innocent person talking to her dead husband, I could see how that would cause some concern. Yeah. We were very confident that she did do it, and of course she did. And eventually was convicted and went to prison. But it was difficult for the judge to kind of understand the logic behind that, but he accepted it.
Now, you had a bit of a personal incident in that cemetery.
Yeah, I was bent over kind of with my back to a fence, and I watching the installer, as we called him, or a technician hooking up wires and burying batteries, and I felt the earth kind of move. We were in a graveyard in the middle of the night, and I heard something breathing very heavily behind me. And I turned around, and I was nose to nose with the biggest cow I'd ever seen that was kind of leaning over the fence trying to figure out what the heck we were doing. So the cow chased us around a bit. We were all screaming like little kids, terrified to be in a cemetery in the middle of the night, let alone this beast chasing us around. So that where the name Digger came from. And of course, the mad cow, I said it wasn't a normal cow. It was definitely possessed by a demonic being. And he didn't get us, but it tried.
Yeah. Now, from there, you moved on to another technical aspect of policing. Tell us about that.
I did. I got promoted to staff sergeant, and I became the staff sergeant in charge of what was called technical operations for the OPP, which is all the technicians that actually do wiretaps. Back then, they climbed poles and all of that. The world's changed a bit since then. Okay. They broke into cars and houses and installed microphones, and they also did photographic surveillance and video surveillance on organized crime figures and undercover deals. And they actually had the ability to defeat alarms and break into houses, pick locks and do all that stuff to do this work. So great bunch of professionals. And I didn't know how to do any of that stuff. I was just their boss, but yeah. I learned a lot from them and did all I could from a leadership perspective to support them, to make sure they had what they needed and got the support they required.
Along the way, you'd done some work with polygraph examinations.
I did. I was polygraph examiner for in between those two jobs, actually. Right. I was a polygraph examiner after wiretaps, which is really kind of where I wanted to go, but the wiretap job came open first. So it was 3 months of training, one of the longest courses in policing in Ottawa. And so I went out and I conducted polygraph examinations and interrogations of those that failed across Ontario. And back in those days, Fred, very few police departments, other than the real big ones, had their own polygraph examiners. So I did tests for all kinds of police departments. I even did them for CSIS and other organizations on national security things, and real interesting times, and a real challenge to try and find out if this person did it, and if they did, get them to admit it, or subsequently prove they didn't do it. And at times I was the only one in the world to finally say, no, I don't think this guy did it, after they'd been accused of something maybe they didn't do.
That's a double-edged sword that some of our viewers may not think of. I think the public perception of polygraph is that it's going to convict you, or at least to accuse you. But there is the other side, that people would be cleared. And that did happen in your experience, Chris?
Very much so. I had one case up in Bracebridge Attachment. It was such a pleasing case. I love to find killers and find people that had abused people and victimized people and get them to confess. But this guy was actually arrested for sexually assaulting a handicapped daughter. And it was just a terrible situation. He bawled his eyes out when I was in to test him. But some information come up, even though he was charged, that he might not have done it. So they asked me to test him. And when I told him I believed him and that he passed the test, he bawled, he hugged me, and they went and interviewed the daughter, who had some serious issues physically, but also was going through some mental health issues and was mad at her dad. So she came up with the story, and she admitted it was all fake. And, but I was the first one to look him in the eye and say, I don't believe it happened. I don't believe you did this. And so I got a lot of pleasure out of that. I didn't capture a bad guy. I proved the bad guy, or an alleged bad guy, didn't do anything wrong. And so a lot of pleasure in that. That's what the double-edged sword was. If they did it, you have to prove they didn't do it. If they did do it, you want to find out they did, that they're lying, and then try and get them to confess.
Now, Chris, you said you wanted to get into investigation, and your next stop was the ultimate OPP investigation bureau, the Criminal Investigation Branch?
Exactly. The CIB, Fred, has been around since the 1800s. Back before the OPP was formed in 1909, government had what they called their Criminal Investigation Branch that really went out and helped the county officers and small police departments all over Ontario to work homicides and to oversee those homicide investigations. And there was in fact, there was a series called The Great Detective that was based on John Wilson Murray, who was one of ththose inspectors in the CIB before the OPP was formed. And so eventually that became part of the OPP as it now exists, still exists to this day. And all the people in there are of the inspector rank, detective inspectors, and their sole purpose in life is conducting major crime investigations, not just murders, but organized crime and large internal investigations and things like government investigations and things of that nature. And so to be in there was kind of the pinnacle of investigations in my view. And so when I got to know what they were all about and worked with those folks, I thought, man, I'd love to be there someday. So that's when I got the opportunity to go there. And I went there, I think I started in 92 in the CIB and as a detective inspector. And wow. And eventually I was the director there. I was the superintendent in charge of CIB at one point, deputy director before that. And what a great place. I mean, anything big happens in the OPP, like we had a recent murder of a police officer up north in the OPP, the CIB would be there within hours, and on and on. They do some pretty amazing work and tough work, difficult. You see a lot of victimization, but pretty wonderful work as well.
Chris, I was amused to learn that when you went into that department, the Ontario Criminal Investigation Branch, the first case you investigated wasn't even in Ontario. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my partner and I were assigned to go to Newfoundland. The Royal Newfoundland Constabulary killed a guy. They weren't even armed officers at that time. They're much like the British model. They didn't carry guns, but they got in a fight with a guy in a bar, a good person who just was having a bad day, that had some tough times in his life, but he was a wonderful guy. But anyway, he was drunk and he wanted to fight the police, so the fight was on. And after the wrestling stopped and they got him handcuffed, they realized he was dead. He had a heart attack. Oh. And so the public, there's a lot of outcry to get an independent body to investigate it, like Ontario had then, the SIU. Yes. Many provinces were forming those. Newfoundland didn't have one. So, right. So the chief had been a Mountie at one time, and he called Tom O'Grady, our commissioner, and said, would you send someone down from the CIB? So my partner and I went, and we investigated that, and we cleared the officers. They did nothing wrong. But it was still pretty interesting to go to another province where you know nobody. You don't even know how to get to the Staples store to buy some paper for your binder. And there we were in St. John's, Newfoundland. So pretty neat.
Chris, you were also involved in an investigation that I think a lot of people will remember, although perhaps not all the details. But this was when you were loaned to the RCMP to establish an investigation in the Cornwall area. Tell us about that.
Well, at one point as a CIB inspector, I went to an attempted murder in Cornwall on the waterway where a man from Quebec was shot while he was smuggling cigarettes, and the load was stolen from him, and he lived, and he wouldn't cooperate with us. And so eventually we walked away from that case. Largely, it turned out to be in Quebec anyway, so we turned it over to the SQ. But I came back to headquarters, and I was telling my boss, that, why are we doing something about the smuggling down there? People in boats going 100 miles an hour shooting at other boats. And why, as law enforcement, why aren't we dealing with this? And well, about a month later, I was assigned to deal with it. And down I went to help the RCMP form a 70-officer task force called the Cornwall Regional Task Force. And to try and put a dent in the smuggling and dealing with very sensitive issues around First Nations rights to tobacco and cross-border issues, covering 2 provinces and New York State and an international border. It was a very big challenge. My instructions were make sure everybody gets along and don't get anybody killed and try and make a difference. And so we accomplished that. We've seized millions and millions of dollars of tobacco and locked a whole pile of people up, and we seized cars and even racehorses from proceeds of crime. But we probably only touched the tip of the iceberg. But we certainly did make a difference and tried to set things to a more stable environment down there for the public.
You were then seconded to the Ministry of the Solicitor General. Tell us about that experience.
Well, that was kind of an interesting job. I've had a lot of interesting jobs, as you can see. And apparently, I can't hold one for very long because after 2 years in Cornwall, I was assigned to be what's called the Director of the Criminal Intelligence Service Ontario, which was part of the Solicitor General Ministry in Toronto. So I reported to a deputy minister, but I was in charge of a group of officers that was a real large kind of conglomerate of police representatives from most police departments in Ontario, including the RCMP and others, Canada Customs, and even the Ministry of Natural Resources, as well as 50-some police services that gathered intelligence and conducted investigations into organized crime. Back then, organized crime was mostly Asian organized crime, the mafia, the traditional organized crime, Italian-based at that point. And some get mad when I say that, but it's a reality of the history of the mafia and outlaw motorcycle gangs. That was through some high-profile murders, Johnny Papilia and Hamilton and Carmen Barolero and Niagara Falls and on and on. There were some high-profile murders in that community. And, of course, the ongoing biker war in Quebec was coming into Ontario. And so pretty interesting job and different because I wasn't out doing police work anymore. I was really funding and coordinating and trying to support those that did. Pretty fascinating times as well.
And a couple of years later, you ended up being promoted to superintendent.
That's right. And that's the only reason I left that job was I got promoted to superintendent. And I was assigned to form a bureau called Emergency Management Bureau, which it really encompassed all of our emergency response entities, the Tactics and Rescue Unit, which I'd been a part of, the Emergency Response Team, which is 256 officers that have special training and do a lot of canine handler backup and barricaded person calls as well. And emergency underwater search and recovery unit, explosive disposal unit, incident command, canine, and all the aviation assets. So aircraft, helicopter, and fixed wing, and public order. And of course, as the protest world was starting to grow, public order became something we had never really done a pile of in the OPP, but we needed to be better at it.
Mm-hmm. And during that time, you dealt with a perceived emergency that probably didn't turn out to be as bad as we all thought it would be. But weren't you there when the Y2K turnover took place?
For sure. And one of the very small units in Emergency Management Bureau was called emergency planning. And we strongly felt that for years in the OPP, we didn't plan around emergencies enough. We just responded when they occurred, whether it be an ice storm or whether it be an earthquake or a tornado. And so we just throw a bunch of resources at it and pull a rabbit out of a hat. But we had a young officer that really was devoted to the planning world. And he came to me one time and said, this Y2K thing may cause massive power outages, which means you won't be able to get fuel for cars because the power will be out. It may mean airplanes falling out of the sky and a whole pile of other things that were predicted, much like Al Capone's tomb. It turned out to be a lot of nothing when the dust settled. But it forced us to really look at a lot of contingencies and making sure municipalities had good plans in place and that we were there to be a part of supporting the communities get through this tough time. So we redeployed 400 officers across Ontario for New Year's Eve in the event that bad things happened, including the one that was my wife, who subsequently, we were just living together then. We hadn't married yet, but I sent her to Kenora as part of the plan. And she said, why are some people going to Bracebridge and I'm going to Kenora? And I said, well, not a coincidence. But I had to certainly set the tone by making sure my wife didn't get a jammy assignment. So she went all the way north and loved it. Yeah. So we bought command posts and we bought more generators and we had all kinds of plans in place to, have fuel distributed and things like that. And so we learned a lot as an organization and then cataloged all that for the future because a lot of those plans will hold true for many, many years to come.
Now, you personally experienced a horrible illness during that year, during the year 2000. Can you tell us about that, Chris? Well,
New Year's Eve, a female employee who's also the wife of a friend had a seizure, which is kind of just a backdrop to what I'm about to tell you. And as it turned out, in the days to follow, they found out she had a malignant brain tumor and and she's no longer with us. A wonderful woman, and her husband lives in this area as well. He lives in Penetang. They were very good friends. And within months of that, I found out I had a brain tumor. And they didn't know if it was malignant or benign, and wouldn't know until they went in. So they cut a very large section of the left side of my head off, a May long weekend in 2000, and they pulled out this tumor, and a bit of gray matter had to come with it, because they have to take a bit of an area around that to make sure they get all the cells from the tumor. And ultimately it was benign. But it affected me for months. I truly thought I'd probably never be back to work. I had no strength left. I had a physical therapy. I used to weight lift and work out a ton, and I couldn't do anything. I could barely walk most days. And so it was a real learning experience to me in a number of fronts, including the human behavior, because I had good friends that didn't want to see me. They didn't know what to say. And I had other people that I didn't necessarily even like that come out of the woodwork to come and wish me well. And, so it was an interesting study in human nature, but an interesting look at myself, because I thought I was going to die. Yeah. And it's really changed me as a person in terms of how I deal with others around me that are going through similar circumstances, and I can offer some support to.
Right. Now, you were back to work in the fall of 2000. And
that's right. I was off for a number of months, and my first day back to work, I was all excited. I had a new suit, and I couldn't drive for a couple of months. So I got my license back, and I was going to work one morning. I had a lunch in my briefcase, and my wife kissed me goodbye, and I went out in the dark to return to work on a part-time basis. I was really excited to go back to work, and it was a little cool out because it was the fall, and there was a bit of black ice in the driveway. And I walked out there, and I flipped head over heels, and I landed on my back. And as my head was going towards the asphalt, I thought, oh my God, don't hit your head. And I kind of snapped my head forward to the point where I felt immediately nauseous, and I threw up all over myself. And I'm lying in the driveway thinking, okay, you're alive. You just ruined a good suit. And then I heard sniffing, and I realized the neighbor's dog had come over and was sniffing me and looking for something to eat. I thought, oh my God, could my day be worse? And then it did get worse because the front light went out. I realized my wife shut the light out. She didn't see me lying in the driveway. But I still got up, and I had to shower and go back to bed. But I got into work the next day, and I worked part-time. And they gave me a couple little internal investigations and things to do. And eventually I went back to the CIB as the superintendent at that time. I didn't go back to my old job. I actually asked them to fill it because I didn't know that I'd ever be back. So I wanted them to continue on doing what they were doing. And so they did fill the job with a very capable individual.
And the next stop in your journey was chief superintendent in the Eastern region.
Yes, I vowed that I had a hard look at my life. I wasn't going to work night and day and work stressful jobs. So I got promoted to chief superintendent, moved to Ottawa, took over all of Eastern Ontario, and which included kind of Belleville, Trenton area, all the way to Quebec. And as far north as Algonquin Park, Bancroft, and all the area right across the Petawawa, and big area, and a couple thousand square kilometers, I suppose, and ultimately 1,200 people and 20 some detachments, and so a big learning curve for me because I hadn't been in what we call field and detachment since I was a corporal. And so I had a lot to learn, and but I enjoyed that. It really challenged me, and a lot of things happened when I was there that really
had were
a test for everybody, including me.
One major event that happened while you were there was 9/11.
9/11.
That had an impact on your force.
It did. I mean, the St. Lawrence Seaway is really all U.S.-Canada border, and there's a number of boarding crossings along there. In Prescott, Gananoque, and on, Cornwall. And so because nobody knew what was happening, and it was anticipated terrorists were taking over the world, Canada Customs asked for help, and they wanted armed officers because they didn't carry guns then. So we sent 4 armed officers 24/7 to every border crossing on the St. Lawrence to support those customs officers. And then a number of planes were forced to land, much like in Gander, Newfoundland. They were forced to land in Ottawa. It didn't get near the media because they didn't have wonderful Newfoundlanders bringing them into their homes. But but we had hundreds of planes in Ottawa on the tarmac, and nobody knew if there was terrorists in them or bombs or knives or whatever. So every plane had to be searched, every person had to be searched. And so we signed a pile of people to help Ottawa and help evacuate the city and put a traffic plan in place because they closed every government building in Ottawa that day.
Yeah.
And so it really was a huge strain on our people, and all of them not knowing what was next, and their families at home wondering, is my husband or wife ever going to get home, and is she going to be okay? So from a leadership perspective, that really challenged me to communicate and be with our people and help them through that time.
There's an interesting story, Chris, about a car crossing from New York State that caused a bit of chaos. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was quite a day, because I got a call that our officers were supporting Canada Customs at the Prescott crossing, and someone had come over from the American side, Ogdensburg, New York, and it was a family, a couple and some children, and there was a body in the car. And so when I got the call, they just found a body in the car. I had visions of this being Al Qaeda or somebody, like Pierre Laporte got kidnapped years ago in Quebec. I didn't know what to expect because none of us did. As it turned out, this poor couple had gone to Florida with their children and grandpa died in the hotel room in Florida of natural causes. Awful, awful story, but if you can find any humor in some of those things in life, rather than ship him home and pay money to do it, they lashed him into the car beside the kids in the back seat, and they booted north. And when they got to the border and the guy wouldn't respond to customs questions, finally they had to admit the poor guy was dead. So, of course, it was all hands on deck at that point. We got a body in the car, and it was just no end to the media issues that came from that, and Queen's Park and everybody in the planet wanted to know what was going on with the body in the car. But it was just a sad situation that kind of became a little comical. You hate to laugh, but if you don't, you'll go crazy. And
it sounds like
that was part of it. In the midst of all of that, we got a body in the car.
Sounds like a Chevy Chase movie, doesn't it?
Oh, it did, exactly. Just exactly like that, without a doubt.
Yeah. The next stop was Chief Superintendent of IT.
Yes.
That was a position you didn't think you'd like.
I didn't want that job. My wife got promoted to inspector. She was a staff sergeant in Ottawa on a secondment outside the OPP when we were down there. And she actually worked for Canadian Associate Chiefs of Police for that couple of year period. She got promoted to inspector and back to headquarters. So they said, what are we going to do with Chris? So they could have left me in the East, but keeping families apart longer than normal isn't really something we like to do. And so I said, just give me the first chief superintendent job that come open. And that turned out to be IT, Information Technology Services Bureau. And I thought, oh my God, I got dragged into the computer world kicking and screaming. I could barely send emails. So anyway, I went there. I didn't understand them. Mostly civilians. It included all our dispatch centers, back then 15 across Ontario, and a new radio network coming, and all cars had to be rewired and on and on. I thought I'd really rather die than go there. But I learned more, and I think developed more as a leader in the 2 years I was there through all of that than I did anywhere else, because I didn't understand them. And I made a point to understand them. And they didn't feel appreciated by the organization because they weren't cops. They were computer technicians and radio operators. And so bringing them in to feel like they're a valid part of the organization and learning about what they do and helping them do it better, supporting them, because they all knew what they're doing. I didn't. They used to draw me little pictures on charts with antennas and stuff to show me how things work. That is simplified to the lowest form. But I learned so much from them, and of course made them feel a part of the organization, that while collapsing 15 comm centers into 5 and rolling out new technology, it was a busy time, but a huge learning experience for me from so many perspectives.
It is fascinating, Chris, how many of the different aspects of policing you got to cover. And in January of 2006, you became the commander of investigation. So you were back again in the area that you originally thought would be your favorite.
For sure. And it's where I'd hoped to spend all my career. But getting out like I did, doing those other jobs really helped prepare me for the eventuality of being commissioner. But So I went back to investigations as chief superintendent. So this director of CID, the director of drug enforcement, the director of intelligence, and all those various investigative entities reported to me. That was at the time of the murder of all the bikers in southwestern Ontario.
Right.
Caledonia was alive and well. There was huge investigation aspects around Caledonia, which was largely a protest, but there was some criminal investigations there too. And so pretty interesting time to go back there and a lot to learn because I was a few years out of the loop but interesting times. And we got through that. And of course, Fantino came when I was about 9 months into that job. He took over the OPP.
Right.
And so he pulled me out of there and made me an acting deputy commissioner in an area called Strategic Services in the fall of 2006. Right. And I stayed there and then eventually got to be deputy commissioner of what's called field operations at that time.
Now, time is never our friend on this program, Chris, and we are running a little short on time. And I want to sort of get through the progression because there are some questions I want to ask you about policing.
Sure.
So in 2007, Julian Fantino appointed you as Deputy Commissioner of Field Operations.
Right.
And so you oversaw a number of things there, including of interest to me, the Aboriginal Policing Bureau. Can you just briefly tell us about what that was? For sure.
The OPP, of course, polices a lot of First Nations communities across Ontario, but they also support First Nations police services with training and funding and expertise and spend a lot of time developing relationships with First Nations leaders and First Nations communities. So given Ipperwash, given Caledonia, there was lots to do there. So the commissioner and I had somebody named Brad Blair, who eventually became deputy commissioner. He oversaw that area. And so we really supported him and bringing new life to it and trying to put more emphasis on building those relationships, which we had failed at for a number of years off and on. Through nobody's fault. We just hadn't necessarily done a great job. But anyway, so that was a big focus of what Fantino and I both were very committed to.
Mm-hmm. And then the next stop is a big one. Appointed commissioner in July of 2010. I want to ask you, how did you feel when that happened? Like this is the culmination of a career. Are you excited or are you nervous?
Well, both, without a doubt. I mean, I applied for the job and I went through an extensive process. And so when I was called by the deputy minister and told the premier's going to announce tomorrow, you're the guy, it was a funny feeling. Not something I aspired to earlier in my career. When I got to be deputy, I could have retired as a deputy quite easily, but I thought, what the heck, I'll give it a shot and do my best to try and, bring more positive change because we're undergoing a change process. And so I took it on. I volunteered and I got the job. And I'm probably the last commissioner ever in history to go into that job without a university degree. Despite a number of university courses, I never did finish my degree.
Let's talk about
interesting.
Let's talk about some of the post-secondary education you did, because you did go to the FBI Academy in Quantico. What were you studying there?
Well, FBI was a executive leadership program. And so a lot of it was around leadership, but also kind of current issues in policing and how different departments are dealing with them around the world. There's 300 students there from around the world for 3 months. So that was a heck of a learning experience and developed some great relationships. But it was associated with the University of Virginia. So it ultimately provided some university credit as well. And at the same time, I took a number of university courses on my own time to try and further that, all to working towards that degree.
Yeah. I saw that you'd done some work at Athabasca University and also took a management program at Northwood University.
Correct.
Which, given where this program originates, we should say is a private university in Midland, Michigan.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It was recommended to me by a friend, and it was all online. And you had to be online certain days at certain times, which is a challenge when you have a job.
Yeah.
Athabasca was more, you had months to get work done. And I also took some from Georgian College as well, all distance education and a number of other executive development courses, another one within the FBI actually later on. So although I never did finish the degree, I totally believe in education and continuing education because that cycle should never end for anyone.
Chris, I want to recognize some of the recognitions that you've received. Order of Merit of the Police Forces. You were an officer and eventually the commander of that order. Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, and the Police Exemplary Service Medal. So you're well decorated, my friend.
Yeah. Those are all such an honor. The commander one was very few get that. So, and I'm not saying that in a conceited way. That was one that really was a real honor, but they were all an honor. And I was also awarded the Members Order of St. John as well later after I retired. And I was very involved with St. John Ambulance for a number of years as well. So it was all, it's all stuff that a kid from Sault Ste. Marie with a high school education never thinks he'd even have a shot at. But I just did my best and worked hard and look at it worked out for me in the long run.
Now you mentioned your wife, Angie. And I've been waiting to ask you this question because when you were commissioner, you would have really been sort of indirectly her boss. Did she ever have to report directly to you, Chris?
She never did, and God forbid that would ever occur because clearly she is the boss at all other aspects of my life. But we did attend meetings where she, as a senior officer, chief superintendent, she was at the table. Didn't report to me, reported to a deputy commissioner.
Right.
But she'd have to raise a point and say, Commissioner, I'd like to add this, or Sir, I would like to add that. And it was always kind of a laugh because the moment we got home, all that relationship changed 180 degrees. And I was always the one begging for forgiveness.
I think our viewers would be fascinated to know how the two of you met.
We met at a murder. And not many people could say love blossomed at a murder scene. But I was married before and I have two wonderful children. And Andrew was engaged to a Mountie at the time we met. And then we worked together in a murder-suicide, which was a tragic thing. But she was a young uniformed constable and I was a CIB inspector. And then years later, we met again, of course, and after Cornwall. And subsequently, we ended up together. And she said I came on a date, never left, but it wasn't quite that exotic. It was, but Angie's just a wonderful person, was a great police officer. And, I couldn't ask for a more wonderful wife and kind of a second mother to my children. And
Wonderful.
It's been a great relationship.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you just some questions about policing, and we are drawing near the end. But I'm wondering what you would view as being the current challenges in policing would be.
Well, I think the media focus on policing, good and bad, has changed the way police operate. From the technology around body cameras, because the police don't have body cameras on, they're the only one at the scene that's not taking pictures and video. That's changed a lot, and that's not a bad thing, but from an evidentiary perspective, it's a good thing.
Right.
But it also forces some accountability, which is a huge concern on the part of the public. The police accountability because of some terrible events and wrong events that occurred, mostly in the U.S., but some in Canada too. The focus on the negativity around some actions by police has been huge. Yeah. And of course, along with that comes protests. The protracted protests, things like Aboriginal protests across Canada or Indigenous people protests over issues that are hundreds of years old that are no winners in some respect for police, but problems for government. That's changed the way policing's done and has impacted resources hugely. And then you've got Black Lives Matter and some of those other protest groups. And I'm not denigrating the importance of any of those concerns, but some of those protests have got really difficult to manage. The agenda's hijacked, become difficult policing issues, and get far away from the valid concerns. Right. They become a policing problem rather than a government problem. And that's caused a huge focus for police.
Chris, what do you see being the major challenges in the next 20 years or so? What will policing look like in 2 decades?
Well, that will continue. And of course, along with that is the protests they call defund the police, where they feel that more money should be spent on other services and not police. No police chief in Canada would disagree with that. It's how do you get to that? You just can't cut the police budget in half and put a bunch of counselors out to go and deal with people with mental health issues that are also armed. So working together with other agencies, which police have been doing for years, but more and more of that needs to occur. And those other agencies need to be properly funded too. And then eventually maybe money can be taken away from the police because police won't be needed as much. But that's going to be a huge challenge for police leaders across North America for the next 10 or 20 years, without a doubt. That impacts morale. And when morale in policing gets bad, so does productivity and sometimes professionalism as well.
Now, with my tongue in my cheek, I'm going to remind you that Julian Fantino, who we spoke about, went into politics, that William Blair, who was a chief in Toronto, went into politics. Should we expect to see Chris Lewis on a political ticket?
You will not see Chris Lewis in the political world. I have to admit, I gave it some thought at one point in my life. I was approached by a leader of one party in Ontario a few years ago, and asked, they tried to recruit me to run. And I used Wayne Frichette's line, the retired chief of Barrie. I said, I'm not interested in going into a job where I'm going to have to tell lies because I wouldn't agree with certain things the party was doing. And I'd be the first to say, I don't agree with that. And, or make promises I have no intention of keeping. I'm not going to do that. That's not Chris Lewis. And no disrespect to politicians on the whole, but we've all seen the good and the bad. And I just don't want any part of that.
Chris, this has been fun. I'm just going to take a moment to thank our viewers. We always appreciate your support of this program. I want to thank the staff at Rogers, who give us wonderful technical support, and also the staff of the Midland Cultural Center, who provide support in terms of programming and promotion of our programs. I want to thank our season sponsors, Kathy Bales, Michelle Bishaw, and Jeff Holloway of RBC Dominion Securities, and our sponsors of this program today, Danielle Dorian and Vanya Gluick, who are from Georgia Bay Dream Team with Rebel Realty Brokerage. Chris, special thanks to you. It's wonderful to get to know a little more about your career. And I should say now that the program's at an end, that you and I are neighbors, and I didn't know all these things about you. So it's good to learn more. And I also will just mention that this program is supported by the Midland Cultural Center. The center is closed right now. We would love to have any support that you might be able to give to the Midland Cultural Center financially. So if you've enjoyed this program, love to have you send in a donation. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Thanks, Brett.